Imagine reading curated opinion pieces that help us better understand policy and politics from the people closest to it, or sometimes people who want to be far from it. We offer political insights without the limit of column inches. Introducing Quotes by Air Quotes Media, creators of the Herle Burly and Curse of Politics podcasts, where we bring politics from the inside out. And now with Quotes, you can read from contributors like Jordan Likeness, Jim Coyle, Jim Stanford, Kathleen Wynne, and this week, Tyler Meredith's thoughts on the federal budget. Read Quotes at airquotesmedia.com/quotes.
Well, happy day after Budget Day, you courageous Herle Burlyites. See, this is me signaling the topic of today's pod. We're breaking down and analyzing yesterday's grocery bag budget with the best public policy thinkers I know. We've had them on here last December as a policy troika, Dr. Jennifer Robson, Sean Speer, and Tyler Meredith. Not only did they say some wickedly smart things, but they had more than their share of podcast camaraderie, or poderaderie. And damn it, we like it here at Air Quotes Media when poderaderie happens. Jennifer is Program Director and Associate Professor of Political Management at Carleton University, where she teaches in public policy and research methods. Her primary areas of research are at the intersection of household finances and the design and implementation of public programs. And we're going to see you on Thursday night with the Curse of Politics, are we not, Jennifer?
And wait for that. Thanks for making time to do that.
That's going to be fun. Sean is Assistant Professor of Public Policy at U of T's Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. Before that, he was Senior Economic Advisor to Prime Minister Stephen Harper. He's also a founder and editor-at-large at the very excellent thehub.ca. And as of January, Tyler is a founding partner at Meredith Boessenkool Policy Advisors. He's the former head of fiscal and economic policy for Prime Minister Trudeau and Ministers of Finance Chrystia, Freeland, and Bill Morneau. This is the first Trudeau budget that Tyler's not had a hand in writing, and he gratefully, as he was having to speculate about what might be in it for the first time, gratefully wrote a piece for Air Quotes Media about what he was looking for in this budget. We'll be interested to see him compare notes versus what he was looking for versus what he got. So there's lots of fiscal firepower with us today, Herle Burlyites. Let's get at it. I want to start by asking each of you, and maybe we'll start with you, Sean, to give us your pithy elevator speech assessment of yesterday's budget. Good, bad, indifferent? Both. What?
My take, David, is that, well, first of all, I should say thanks for having me and great to be back on with Tyler and Jen, who I not only have a lot of respect for as policy thinkers, but as you said, just like to have a good time nerding out. I described yesterday as something like nerd prom on a radio interview I did in the morning, and I have no doubt that Tyler and Jen would make good dates at something like that. I think the pre-positioning on the budget around fiscal restraint will prove to be overstated. We can get into that in some detail, but it seems to me the Trudeau government has a predisposition to see the benefits of public spending without the same tendency to think about the opportunity costs or the downside effects of different types of public spending, and that manifested itself in yesterday's budget. Spending is up each and every year, even relative to the November fall economic statement. If my estimates are right, between November and yesterday, which amounts to about 145 days, we've seen about $40 billion in incremental spending. So I guess that's a long way of saying I think restraint proved to be fleeting, that the government is what this government is, which is a government that has a kind of positive view about the role of the state in our economy and society, and a predisposition to spend.
Tyler, weird day for you yesterday, I imagine.
A little bit weird, but I mean, I used to do budget commentary before I was in government in the think tank world, so I feel like I went back to it just with maybe a slightly larger audience. Anyway, it was fun nonetheless yesterday. I mean, I overall, if I had to grade the budget, I would give it an A-, and I say that because
an A-?
An A-, yes.
All right.
And the reason I say that is because I think, number one, for the things that the government had said, apart from restraint, as Sean mentioned, but for the things that it had said that it was going to do in advance, which were how to create an economic blueprint in a clean growth economy, 2, how to invest in healthcare, and 3, how to deal with some affordability challenges in a targeted way. It not only met those expectations, I think in some ways actually exceeded them, and exceeded them in some areas without needing to spend money. There was a lot of things that were kind of regulatory, that were very retail oriented. They've got a lot of good political stuff there. I would say where it probably was missing was on housing, and that was a choice. They've done actually a decent job with some policy stuff to date, but it's just not the urgency and the scale of what I think people are looking for at the moment. That may be a political vulnerability for them going forward. But what's interesting in all of that, I think, is that it actually is a budget that's more selective. It's more focused. It's not a Christmas tree of a lot of other stuff. And that may be, in and of itself, an important turn for this government, because I think there's been questions in the last year about execution and focus. And this, I think, in principle, kind of shows that in a bit of a slimmer, more focused set of agenda. Not as Sean says, necessarily meaning less spending, but certainly more focused on a few things where it could go deeper.
Super interesting. A-. All right, Jennifer.
Okay, so we're doing letter grades. Can we go with, I don't know, B? I guess maybe I'm a harder marker. Look, my guess, sort of my top line on this budget is...
Don't take her class. Students who are listening.
Don't take my class. Still learn a lot.
Freeland never got a B in her life. You know that.
So this budget reminds me a little bit of ages ago when I used to go and pick up one of my kids from daycare, and she would have torn up little bits of paper and she would hand them to me all super excited to say, "Hey, Mom, I made you bits." And this feels to me a bit like a budget of bits. It's not that it's necessarily that some of the individual pieces of content are bad. What I have a hard time is sort of seeing how these all hang together. And, you know, having been in the lockup yesterday, it felt a little bit like officials were a bit pained to sort of explain the story of how it was that they came to land on, yes, we're going to be addressing dental care. Yes, we're going to be responding to the U.S. Incentives around clean energy and clean tech, but not really also then being able to say, but we have also made a concerted decision to not do certain things that we have been promising for a long time, EI reform, for example. So I guess I'm still struggling with. We can take each of those bits on its own and talk about the good and the bad, and let's get into the weeds. But I'm still struggling with, like, what is the overall economic agenda that they are trying to pursue here?
Well, that's interesting, because let's get into some of the detail of this now. Because Jennifer, I mean, I thought the budget actually had a pretty clear focus. It just wasn't the focus that the government wanted to talk about particularly. I mean, the minister first positioned this as a restraint budget, and is clearly not a restraint budget. And then the prime minister positioned it as an affordability budget, and I would argue it's not an affordability budget either. But what it really seems to me to be is an industrial policy budget. And in fact, it reminds me a lot, because I'm so bloody old, it reminds me a lot of Alan McEachin's 1980 budget, in which there wasn't much in the budget aside from the National Energy Program. The National Energy Program was effectively the budget of the day. And this is this is similar to that in the sense that there's a big industrial policy piece embedded in this, but they haven't really wanted to talk about it that way. So let's start with that. First of all, there's a lot of attention being focused on these new tax credits as a way of allowing Canada to compete with the United States under the Inflation Reduction Act. Is it enough, and is it designed in a way that it will work?
Oh man, that is an $80 billion question for the next decade. I think it's really important to remember that those tax credits, right, like what they're competing against in the U.S. as well as in Europe. In the U.S., yes, it is very deliberately, explicitly a new wave of industrial policy with a whole bunch of social goals embedded very explicitly. Lots of good discussion to be had either way around whether or not embedding those other social goals actually makes sense. But when you look at the U.S. package, yes, it is tax incentives that are actually structured and designed in a slightly different way. But it is also massive infrastructure spending. By contrast, this budget basically said, we're currently winding down our major infrastructure spending, details to follow right? Sort of like punt that piece, right? The other piece that is in the United States is not just the clean energy and clean tech, but also, the CHIPS Act. So basically those two things work hand in glove. We didn't really have anything that would respond to that, although maybe that's an oversight, maybe not. I would love to be able to hear the government talk about why it made the decisions that it did, right, in terms of those tax credits. And your question around, like, are these the right measures? Are they too big, too small? Let's remember, like, these are refundable tax credits, so they are spending by a different name, right? This is it's a different way of program spending, and there's going to be an awful lot of uncertainty. The United States, the total package is estimated at what, 390 odd billion US. But with the tax credits, I think a lot of this is going to come down to delivery and implementation. This is not turf that CRA has necessarily had a long track record in. The scientific SHRED tax credit, scientific research and exploration. Sorry, I'm going to get the full name of the acronym, but everybody knows what SHRED is, right?
Have a drink.
Thank you.
Turn the SHRED tax credit into a drinking game.
That review is still ongoing. Again, that's another can that got kicked down the road. My thinking here is, like, this could be great. This could be great. I don't know. Right. And a lot of it is going to pan out over the years in terms of what is the actual take up. Could be bigger, could be smaller than the 80 billion that they have forecast over the next decade. And in practice, are they going to be able to do the delivery? And those are two big questions for me.
Tyler, can I jump in first? Because I'd like in part to have you I'd be interested in your response to what I say.
Yeah, go ahead.
Make a couple of points. First of all, I think there's a lot of interesting policy innovation reflected in some of the clean tech energy transition incentives reflected in yesterday's budget. I think if you were to identify the most exciting parts of the budget, that's what I would point to. I know Tyler and Jennifer will point to some other measures that they've been championing for a long time. Just on the generosity of the incentives and how they compare to what's reflected in the Inflation Reduction Act. It's worth remembering, of course, David, that Canada's tax incentives will be stacked on top of the carbon tax, which is already doing a lot of work in terms of incentivizing firms to invest in technologies that reduce their costs through a rising carbon tax. So in that sense, we didn't need to necessarily match them dollar for dollar. It'll be interesting to see. I'm sure groups like the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices and others will be doing analysis in the coming days to figure out what an apples to apples comparison looks like. But on the face of it, it's not obvious to me that the government got the quantum wrong, by a magnitude. The second thing I'll say, though, this is an item in the budget that I think has gone underappreciated and may represent the most significant political item in the budget, David. And that is the commitment to move ahead with what's called contract for difference. In effect, it's a pretty technocratic idea, but in effect, what it means is the government will enter into contracts with energy companies to effectively guarantee that that as the carbon tax goes up, they'll be able to make those investments in different types of technologies, knowing that they're saving money related to the carbon tax, even in the event that the carbon tax doesn't go up, either because this government decides to halt the increases or an incoming government, say led by Pierre Poilievre, repeals the carbon tax as he's committed to.
That's really what it's about, right? Is getting people to make that move now rather than wait and see who wins the next election, right?
Exactly. Now, there's a lot of kind of policy rationale for this idea. I was on BNN last night, and Ronna Ambrose was speaking about the benefits of the idea of contract for difference. But I think we're kidding ourselves if we think of it as merely a technocratic policy idea. This is an explosive political proposition that you can imagine what Pierre Poilievre will do with it. I mean, in effect, an argument that the government is trying to bind future governments from repealing the carbon tax, which is key to his political proposition. We don't quite yet know what the magnitude of those contract for differences will be. It will involve a kind of case-by-case basis in working out those details with individual energy companies. But I think, this budget probably won't make it through to next week in terms of attention and focus. But I'd say that if there is one item that has long-lasting political implications, it's this technocratically described contract for difference, which I suspect we'll be hearing a lot about in the coming months and years.
Violent windstorms, wildfires, atmospheric rivers, the march of COVID worldwide. We've talked about all of it here the last number of weeks. More specifically, how our presenting sponsor TELUS pulls out all the stops to keep people connected when these natural disasters threaten that connectivity. TELUS has resilience and reliability coded into their company DNA in two distinct strands. One, they invest billions to build differently than their competitors. And two, they act differently, going above and beyond to keep us connected in the most extreme circumstances. What's the phrase? Controlling the controllables. Seems to me that's exactly what TELUS works hard to do. But there is a challenge to network reliability that has nothing to do with anything the natural world might produce. In fact, it's entirely the product of human behavior, and more than a little onerous to control. Cable theft and the vandalism of network infrastructure. Geez, that sounds a bit anodyne, so let me be more descriptive. People are out there slicing into network cables in search of copper wire, and then stealing the metal, which they resell. Now, you might recall TELUS has largely upgraded to much stronger and durable fiber optic cables, replacing the older copper. But a cable looks like a cable. Thieves don't figure that out until they've already cut into it. By then, the damage is done, and there's danger. To the thieves who come into direct contact with live cables, to first responders called to the scene, to technicians who restore service, and to the communities who temporarily lose connectivity to essential services and loved ones. Herle Burlyites, 44% of all TELUS major outages due to cable damage since 2015 are the result of thieves on the hunt for copper. This kind of human threat to network resilience and reliability, it's a hell of a challenge to control for. But TELUS is investing in things like drone surveillance and predictive software to prevent the impacts of theft. Taking other measures too. They're up for it.
Just before I go in on the question of industrial strategy, I just want to follow up on that point that Sean made. Because Sean, I agree with you that it is a significant sea change in policy if it is in fact implemented. But let's remember it's being implemented for a very real reason, which is we saw a version of this with Doug Ford in Ontario, right? When the carbon trading system was eliminated and all of those contracts had to get ripped up, right? So there are real consequences to changing policy down the road that businesses need to price in that they may not have necessarily priced in. I'd be curious your reaction to that. But
yeah, no, I don't disagree. As I say, I think there's a reasonable policy case for something like this, especially given the gradual increase of the carbon tax. If the carbon tax was going to $170 per ton in the next few years, it may not be needed. But because of the gradual slope, the policy rationale may or may not be strong. But all I'm saying, in the hands of Pierre Poilievre, this strikes me as an explosive idea. And I think a lot of the policy wonks thinking and talking about it are underestimating just how explosive it'll be. You can just envision Pierre Poilievre making the case that this government is, in effect, binding not just his government, but Canadians' ability to change policy in the next parliament, whenever that is. So it's a very long way of saying, irrespective of one thing about the policy, I think it may be the single most important kind of political bomb embedded in the few hundred-page budget that was tabled yesterday.
So, Tyler, can I just trigger you with a question about the incentives that are in the budget? There's something I'm not understanding about the money. These tax credits, which appear to be a centerpiece of this plan, are estimated to cost about $80 billion over 10 years. Is that right?
About $20 billion of that is going to be from the infrastructure bank.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that sounds like a lot of money. But I'm hearing rumors that the combined federal and provincial contribution to the Volkswagen battery plant is $20 billion for a plant that employs 1,600 people, that the governments will have put somewhere close to $20 billion. So that doesn't make $80 billion sound like a lot. Where does that Volkswagen money come from out of this budget?
Well, it's very interesting you asked that question, because when the previous question you posed about what's the purpose of the industrial strategy made me think that, the goal that the government had to address going into this was it needed to, one, lock down the investments that were already in play before the US did their big bang announcement last summer. It then needed to try to still attract and deliver on the things that were already in flight, like carbon capture and storage over the past 2 years. And then it needed to try to kind of put these things together in a coherent package. So it's not trying to say, what is our thoughts on every single industry? And there's some industries that are left out here. And, I think the tech sector has rightly said, given the stress that we're facing, where are we? Why is the shred review not happen? Those are all fair, and the government will have to address that. But this was clearly about how do you build the actual stuff, the goods and the actual clean tech goods that we're going to need in the future, right? And how do you also decarbonize as you go through that process with large legacy industries? And look, if the goal in that respect, as I framed it, was you got to get basically the Stellantis deal that you already signed before the IRA to maintain that. You've got to attract somehow the VW deal and add on that. You've got to actually unlock the investments in CCUS that people have been talking about for years, but they're all off in the distance, but none of them have moved to final investment decisions, right? Now the government has tried to take off the table all of the reasons that people put out there, including contracts for difference, which had emerged in the last year as the latest thing that people were concerned about as to why it was stopping them from making an investment decision. So the government has taken all of those things that were on the table, the business community was saying needed to happen. They've tried to address them sequentially, one by one. And now the question will be, do businesses actually invest? And there's a really important test there. Is the business community going to step up and actually put the capital where their ideas have been over the last number of years? I think that's an interesting question to watch. And on your question about the VW deal, I mean, I was looking through the budget to see, were they going to have a below the line kind of line measure, as we often kind of know that there's money set aside, but it's not tagged to anything, and that would stick out like a sore thumb, and you'd say, okay, that's the VW money because it's so big. But I didn't see that, right? I didn't see that. So either they've not profiled it into the budget, or it's actually not as big as some people are chattering in rumors. So I mean, it's an important thing we have to still watch for.
The VW money is apparently there.
Sorry, Jennifer.
Go ahead, Jennifer.
I was just going to say the VW money is there. We just there is no sort of bright line as to.
But they won't tell us how much they've put into VW because they're telling us that they're negotiating with a bunch of other people and they don't want to jeopardize their commercial. So somehow I think of this as like $100 billion that they've got in a fund that they're going to hand out to companies to invest here. But I don't see that anywhere in the budget numbers.
Yeah, the VW budget numbers are they're very well camouflaged. They're in there somewhere, but they're very well camouflaged.
Okay, hey Jennifer, I got a question for you.
Hold on, David. May I just take up your original question to Jennifer about the kind of lack of charismatic vision around these investments? Like, if you're going to put $80 billion over 10 years into something, you have to be politically committed to it, and you have to have a charismatic vision that people can see themselves in. And I do think it is funny that seems to be missing from the Trudeau government. It has a pretty exciting futuristic vision around the clean transition, the energy transition. And as you say, David, for some reason, it seems a bit self-conscious about that. I'm afraid I don't know why.
It's not what gets them going. It's not what gets them going. I mean, here was the question I was going to ask. We have put in place policies that now mirror Joe Biden's policies, except that Joe Biden talks about this as a jobs plan, as an economic growth and a jobs plan. And we talk about it as a race to net zero plan, as a climate change plan. In my view, he's way closer to the politics of this than we are, than the Liberal government is in talking about this effectively. But what is it really? Is this a climate change policy that throws off jobs, or is this a jobs policy that has some ancillary benefits for climate change?
So when I was in the lockup yesterday, I think I'm allowed to say this part, I did ask if there was any modeling on jobs impacts. And I think there's a reason that we're not hearing any estimates of job creation, right? With regards to these incentives. That would probably be pretty damn tough to be doing, right? Given the fact that these are investment tax credits. The U.S. tax credits are structured a little differently in the sense that they are production tax credits, right? Like they are subsidy, like their equivalent one on clean electricity is a per kilowatt subsidy, right? With sort of like incentives and ramp ups. Yeah. Look, Biden talks about his package deal. In terms of jobs, they've managed to get a couple of NGOs, credible ones, to put out some estimates of the jobs that have been created as a result. But remember as well, like he's also talking about it as it's job creation. It's affordability, because this is about lowering the cost of fuel and heating and all the rest of it for our homes. This is infrastructure. And because he has also layered on, and again, I come back to this issue of like, it's an open economic question as to whether or not this is good policy or not, a whole bunch of other kind of basically social policy kinds of objectives in terms of
you don't like the union equivalent jobs thing?
No, I'm not saying I don't like it.
I like it.
I'm not just saying I don't like it or whatever, right? Like, so, we've mirrored some of that here in Canada with the new tax credits in the form of, figuring out prevailing wages under collective agreements and some apprenticeship, annual hours components. And that may all be for the good, but in the United States, remember, there's a whole bunch of other stuff as well with regards to distributive effects, partnerships, local reinvestment, all that kind of thing. That some voices are now saying, actually, this is starting to get in the way of actually being able to reap the rewards. Now, in Canada, I think they are so far talking about this predominantly as this is climate adaptation. This is competition with the prevailing winds and so forth in the United States and the EU. Would this have more political traction if they could talk about it in terms of job creation? I don't know, but I think that would be really hard to credibly do given the structure of how they've chosen to spend the tax money.
So can I just come in on that point, David? Because what I would say is that what's interesting here, right, is that yes, on a number of levels, what you're seeing is the government trying to match the United States or trying to respond to the instruments that the United States has put on the table. But the reality is the government's been working on a lot of this stuff for months and years before the United States was even talking about carbon capture and storage or hydrogen or clean electricity, right? Like the IRA just kind of came out of nowhere. It had been obviously there'd been a lot of work that had been building in civil society and through the 2020 election cycle with Biden, but it was going nowhere. The Build Back Better agenda was kind of going nowhere until last summer when suddenly there was an agreement with Senator Manchin because they needed to get something done before the midterms, right? The government had just to level set, the CCUS tax credit, right, which is a significant part of the government's overall industrial strategy here that we saw unveiled yesterday, is something that was announced in the 2021 federal budget and has been in development since then. The clean investment credits is something that has been announced over the last year and comes from previous platforms of the Liberal Party. We've made investments to lower the corporate tax rate for clean for clean tech goods, and that was something that had been campaigned on by the Prime Minister in 2019. I think what's interesting out of all of this is that it's given the Prime Minister an opportunity to try to reframe how you stitch all of that together as an economic blueprint, other than these individual kind of initiatives that now actually have some coherence that says we're investing in auto jobs in Southern Ontario. We're exploring critical mineral and exploration jobs in Northern Ontario, Northern Quebec, and Newfoundland. We want to support oil workers and gas workers in Alberta and British Columbia and Saskatchewan. We want to support battery production and exploration in those areas. We want to help with hydrogen development, right? You've got a little bit of almost every region's industrial base in a clean growth, decarbonized world. And I just think that's as a shift in how we think about this stuff, that's really interesting.
Well, but that's just it, isn't it, Tyler? You outlined various policy actions the government has taken, but I come back to my point and David's point that I mean, in effect, the government is proposing to put an end to the internal combustion engine in before the halfway point of this century. It's an audacious plan, akin to the Apollo project of the 1960s. And yet the government just doesn't seem committed to thinking and talking about it that way. It's peculiar to me. It strikes me as a huge missed opportunity that fails to convey to Canadians how, as you say, how all of these various subsidy programs and tax incentives and so on fit together. Like, David, how many Canadians know right now that it is government policy that by 2035, 100% of all car sales in Canada have to be EVs?
Zero. Zero people know that.
No one knows that. But that is the government policy on record. They're proposing, according to their policy, to go from about 8 or 9% today to 100% by 2035. That's an audacious plan. And it seems to me at some point, the government needs to get out and tell that story. I think the former environment
people
minister
buying a new car, by the way, should know what the resale value is likely to be of their internal combustion engine vehicle.
Exactly. The previous minister was too polarizing, I think, to be able to deliver that aspirational, mission-oriented message. I think the current minister seems competent but a bit technocratic. I think at the end of the day, it has to be the prime minister, because this is the agenda, as yesterday's budget outlined, that is ultimately going to define this government. And at present, it's a lot of disparate policies. But as Tyler says, at some point soon, it needs to piece them together and tell a charismatic story.
Yeah, but have you ever heard the prime minister talking excitedly about the economy? I have not. So it's not likely to happen. Remember the Velveeta ads? Some of us do. They'd pop up on evening TV shows back in the days of mass appointment viewing. A ripe-voiced narrator would talk over pictures of a happy mom in the kitchen, narrating all sorts of bizarre recipes in which the central ingredient was Velveeta cream cheese. So weird. The ads were a hilarious part of the 60s and 70s zeitgeist in Canada, and now, of course, they're gone. The reason anyone watched them at all back then was choice, or lack of it. Audiences were more captive. In some parts of the country, there was only one channel. Certainly nothing was on demand. It was just a different world. Actually, lack of choice back in those days determined quality of life for whole swaths of the population. Prairie grain farmers were often effectively bound to a single shipping company and a single railroad to move their crop. It was monopolistic. Farmers would load up their 3-ton grain truck day after day, heading off to the nearest wooden grain elevator and paying whatever they were charged. It was just the way it was. To put it mildly, all that has changed. The 3-ton truck and ubiquitous wooden elevators have faded into history, replaced by high-throughput grain handling hubs and the Super B truck, which can haul up to 42 tons of grain at a time. The Super B has a longer range, meaning farmers get to choose where they'll sell their crop and to whom. And because of that, farmers now get to choose their railroad too. A single company no longer dominates entire rural economies. Our sponsor, CN, is a vigorous contender in this world of choice. It competes hard for agribusiness. CN's prime directive is punctuality. Its trains leave on time, arrive on time, and deliver cargo smoothly and safely. It has set records this year for grain shipments. To be clear, the reality of 2023 is competition. And competition, as opposed to more regulation, elevates everyone. Praise be, and pass the cream cheese. Something that really occurred to me that I thought was big about this, Sean, start us off with this, is my entire life has been full of Canadian government efforts to diversify our economic relationship away from its reliance on the United States. Mm-hmm. And, early on it was Europe, and then latterly it's been Asia. But if I look at Joe Biden's speech and this to the House of Commons and this budget as a call and response thing, it looks to me like those dreams are over, and that Canada is about to voluntarily nestle into the embrace of the United States in a way that would make C.D. Howe thrilled.
C.D. Howe, a member of parliament from my hometown of Thunder Bay. So That's a reason for another drink. Yeah, I think that's right. We talked about this last time we were on the show, that, of course, which was before all of the noise these days about Chinese interference in our elections. But even then, it was pretty clear that Canada's position vis-a-vis Asia and general and China in particular was changing, that we were going to start to look at industrial policy along continental lines. And I think developments in the past several weeks and months, including President Biden's visit, have only pushed us further in that direction. And I happen to think that's a positive step, and one that hopefully, David, breathes new life into a North American agenda. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention I have my own podcast. And a couple of weeks ago, I spoke to Tom DeQuino, who you no doubt know, about his book concerning his career in the world of policy and politics. And one of the things he lamented was that progress on a North American agenda, which was really a major source of aspiration at the beginning of this century, had stalled for some time. And one can't help but think that that is going to have a new breath of life when it comes to regulatory harmonization, immigration, science and technology partnerships, environment, including, who knows, maybe someday a continental carbon price. I think there's reason to think that the future rests in a North American partnership.
Canadians used to be concerned about these things, Jennifer.
Yeah, I mean, I'm old enough to remember the free trade debate a little bit. I was listening again to a really interesting, it was kind of an exit interview with Brian Deese, who just recently left as head of Biden's Council of Economic Advisors, which, on the way, that's still another one we're waiting to find out if this government is going to do anything on. Anyway, but they
could just listen to this pod. That would be good enough.
That's true. They could.
Yeah.
I thought a couple of things that he was saying was really, really interesting. That, if we are talking about a world in which there is a bit more of a renaissance of a North American relationship, let's be really clear-eyed about how the U.S. views this. Right? I mean, they are unapologetically including lots and lots of Buy American measures in their package. They are unapologetically saying their intention, right, is to gain dominance, right, in the production and innovation of an awful lot of these clean tech and manufacturing areas where they see opportunities for growth, both and strategic value, right, both in terms of economic, but also, frankly, international security reasons and motivations for them. And they sort of see it in terms of hey, look, friends and partners, we're actually kind of doing you a favor by providing some stability and incentives. And, you're going to benefit through lower prices as long as you're buying our stuff. Right. And so I'm wondering whether or not we have to all dust off our Staples theory again or something, in terms of thinking about what this new relationship is going to look like. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Tyler, do you have anything to say about trade integration, or should we move on to the fiscal track?
Well, I'll just say you could make the case that this is the friendshoring budget, right? That this is the budget that, and it's interesting given what we were talking about on our podcast in December about the Indo-Pacific strategy, which had been the backdrop of an announcement from the government in November, right? Which of these two tension points was going to be where the government would follow? And clearly, I think you've seen that even though the Indo-Pacific strategy is official government policy, friendshoring is actually where it puts its emphasis and attention. And, you couldn't have asked for a better follow through for the budget than what happened with the Biden visit. I mean, Biden basically walked into Canada and said,
deliver this budget.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, everything you're doing is right, and I like this prime minister, and I want to keep working with them as an overall setup. So look, I think maybe the one thing I would say is that as part of that integration agenda, though, what's different, I think, from past discussions about North American integration is that clearly on the U.S. side, and certainly in Canada, but we just haven't said it as emphatically, unions are part of that integration, right? Unions are a source of good jobs. And how we create these good jobs has to move through unions as a vehicle for how you kind of support middle class success. And, that's interesting because Justin Trudeau, I know, in the course of politics, you guys were talking about how many times Biden mentioned unions in his speech, and that's important. Justin Trudeau's probably the most labor-friendly prime minister that has existed since probably Mackenzie King, who, by the way, was a minister of labor before he was a prime minister. And some of that has been lost, but that is clearly at the heart of what this friendshoring strategy looks like.
All right, cool. All right, the other thing that's bound to raise commentary, and when I asked for suggestions about what we should talk about on Twitter, I got a lot of suggestions. We should talk about the fiscal track of this budget. When the Chrystia government took office, it announced that it had been left by Mulroney a $42 billion deficit. And this was considered to be a national crisis that precipitated massive change in approach to government. Now, I know that $42 billion in 1993 terms is about 20 billion or 20-something billion today. So it's not the same thing. But I'm interested that nobody seems really at all troubled by the fiscal track here. The markets didn't move or react to it. And in part because I'm curious, because I don't believe it. Because I don't believe that that the spending is going to be near what they say it is. And I don't have to go down Andrew Coyne's rabbit holes to do that. I just have to look at it and say, there's no new defense spending in here. This seems unrealistic to me over any length of time. There's nothing in here for higher public sector wages. That seems likely coming down the track at us pretty quickly. There's no new money in here for Indigenous reconciliation, and some multi-billion-dollar award seems to pop up every second week for something here or there or the other. So there's a lot of spending, it seems to me, that isn't even included here, and they don't have a path to balance. So to me, when did these things stop mattering, Tyler? When did the deficit stop mattering?
Well, I mean, I think it hasn't had that political effect because it doesn't matter to voters, right? And the voters have not made this an issue. And I think you saw that fiscal policy was a clear choice on offer in the 2015 election, and people decided to take a different path. And since then, we are where we are. I mean, I am generally not worried about the sustainability of the fiscal track. I think, even though we're, if you believe the baseline scenario, going to have a deficit this year of about 40-some billion, that's still lower than previous projections had been in previous budgets about this particular fiscal year that we're about to enter. Now, we still have a deficit in 27-28 that's relatively large in dollar terms. But remember, Canada will still have overall likely the smallest deficit as a share of GDP and the lowest debt as a share of GDP of all of our G7 partners. And that's I know that for most Canadians that doesn't matter, but that really is how you would measure fiscal sustainability.
It's not often that you find labor and industry coming together, but that's the case for our sponsor Uber and their collaboration with the United Food and Commercial Workers of Canada. Why would the leading rideshare and delivery platform in Canada and one of the country's largest private sector unions work together, you may ask? The answer may surprise you, folks. The fact of the matter is that in 2023, there are no legislative frameworks in place that offer benefits and protections to gig workers like drivers and delivery people. Tired of the status quo, Uber and UFCW Canada sought a way to create a better future for app-based workers across the country. The landmark agreement they signed on January 27, 2022, outlines their commitment to over 100,000 drivers and delivery people on Uber. 89% of them support this agreement. What does this look like in action? When Wasim from Toronto got locked out of his Uber driver account after trying to add his new car, he didn't have to tackle this issue on his own. Wasim was able to contact UFCW, explained his situation, and a casework team member helped him get back on the Uber platform. Before the agreement, Wasim's story and hundreds like it would not have been possible. With the agreement in place, over 750 drivers and delivery people had access to representation when they needed it most. Learn more about the impact of this historic agreement for hundreds of people like Wasim at uber.com/UFCW Canada. But so is there a real new modern monetary theory? Did this take effect and nobody announced it? Because what you said is, we're bad, but everybody else is worse. So it doesn't matter that we're bad if everybody else is worse. So what does it mean about the way these things are considered now? We're financing of governments. I'm not trying to be flip. It feels a lot looser than it used to feel.
Well, let me jump in. I think Conservatives in hindsight made something of a mistake back in the Harper years, David. Our interaction between fiscal policy and political strategy had two assumptions at the heart of it. The first was if you lowered the GST, you'd lock in that right because no subsequent government would be prepared to take on the political risk associated with raising the GST.
That was correct.
The second part of that assumption was that deficit financing outside of recessions was politically forbidden. And so you would effectively constrain the ability of subsequent governments to be able to pursue activist agendas, including significant increases in spendings, because you would constrain revenues and they would then be constrained by what was a convention of balanced budgets. And what the Liberal Party did in 2015 was to challenge that second assumption, as Tyler says. And now, what is almost a decade later, they haven't changed in a major way anyway. The revenues available to the government. Not only has the GST remained at 5%, but other major sources of tax revenue has similarly remained mostly unchanged. But what we've seen is a pretty significant increase in public spending financed by deficits and debt. And I think it's important to acknowledge that is not simply a pandemic story. In the years leading up to the pandemic, public spending was growing about 6% per year. Looking ahead, post-pandemic, the growth rate is slightly lower, although, as you say, David, there's reason to think that those projections probably represent numbers that will go up over time because of some of these various pressures. I would just say, before handing it over to Jen, that I don't know what your experience was at finance, David, with Mr. Martin, but I got to tell you, Jim Flaherty would have quit before he tabled a budget that saw the 27-28 year go from a surplus of $4.5 billion in November to a deficit of 14.5 in yesterday's budget. He would have insisted through some combination of reprofiling, spending projections, savings, fiscal savings, possibly even revenue enhancements if necessary. He just would not. He stubbornly would not have tabled a budget that saw such a significant change from surplus to deficit in such a short period of time. And I think that alone tells you, at least for this government, concerns about deficits just resonate less than they did through the late 90s and through a good part of the Harper years.
People only cared about deficits once for a very brief period of time. And that was in the mid-90s when people came to the conclusion that the big government deficits were hurting their situation. They were damaging the economy. They were impeding their ability to get a job. And we couldn't have a good economy till we got rid of that deficit. Absent that personal relationship, it's an abstraction. And people are always more concerned about their own balance sheets than they are about the government's balance sheet. And so at the moment, people are not interested particularly. And certainly as long as most elite commentators are saying it's fine, the general public's not going to engage in this. I'm just interested in why all the elite commentators are also fine with it. But Jennifer raises a really difficult question for me. If you're a progressive and you see problems out there that you still want to solve in our society, if you say, well, dental care is great, so is pharmacare. I wish we had pharmacare, and I wish we had mental health supports. And if you say, we need to do a better job at raising the Indigenous standard of living in this country, and you continue to look around, are there actual sources of revenue to pay for these things, or are progressives stuck with borrowing?
Sean's comment about the political legacy of the GST cut early in the Harper years reminded me that, governments since time immemorial have been basically trying to bind, their successors. That is one, right? That for a variety of reasons is politically taboo, but is there. The budget does have some very modest changes on the revenue side and the taxation side in terms of, financial institutions, the changes to the alternative minimum tax for the very highest earners. All of these things, may be worth doing in terms of smart tax policy, but they're not going to be major revenue generators, right? They're not going to fundamentally change the.
I was told on a call of investors this morning, that was a part of a webcast this morning, some investment analysts told their clients that they thought the alternative minimum tax might apply to a couple thousand people in Canada.
That's about right. Yes.
Sounds about right.
Yeah.
Sounds about right.
So sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Yeah,
no.
But it's all good. All good. So those are not going to meaningfully move the dial. Your question about, are we basically stuck with borrowing? Look, I think it's always important to ask, borrowing to do what? All right. It's not just about the overall volume of what we're spending, but also where are those dollars going and what are we getting for them? Like, what is the activity that is actually being generated and what are the returns on that going to be? I think about this, especially in relation to a file I spent a bit of time on, and I know both Tyler and Sean have spent a lot of time on this file as well, which is what to do about employment insurance. And, that to me is a really interesting example in the sense of it is supposed to be self-financing now. Right. So every policy change has to be paid for through financing changes within the system. And the budget yesterday was completely silent on this. Now, there's the hopeful part of my brain that says maybe that means the conversation has just been delayed by a few months. I think Minister Qualtrough was saying there's still something coming in spring. We'll see, I suppose. Does it mean that somehow, real progressives need to find some energy for having the conversations about the rebalancing of revenues? Yeah, probably. Is that a sexy and attractive political fight to have? Probably not. Probably not a super easy one. It's much easier to do these things at the margins that touch very few, very elite taxpayers in this country. But I think the rubber is really going to hit the road when it comes time, eventually, maybe someday, to talk about EI reform, because those two things, you can't have the policy conversation without talking about the financing.
When Stéphane Dion talked to me about the green shift, I said to him that I was unaware of anybody at any level of politics in any jurisdiction in the world who had been elected on a platform of increasing taxes.
Yeah, even Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who I would put forward as likely the most full-throated exponent of a big audacious view of the role of government in the Anglo-American world, is insistent that any tax proposal that increases taxes on households below $400,000 in income is something that she would oppose. So it seems to me progressives and conservatives find themselves with what amounts to kind of inverted problem. People don't want to pay for things. On one hand, they won't support higher tax rates. On the other hand, they want more spending. And so up until now, the Trudeau government has effectively squared that circle through deficit financing, as has center-right governments, frankly, around the world. But it seems to me, one wonders, David, if the political context may be evolving in some way in which people will start to be more responsive to arguments about the limits of government spending. And obviously, that's something that Pierre Poilievre is betting on.
Can we just put this in concrete terms? So, if we actually want to balance the budget, right? And let's say we didn't want to even balance the budget this year. We wanted to balance it, let's say 3 years or even 5 years from now, which, as Sean will remember, that was actually Andrew Scheer's platform commitment in 2019, which Aaron O'Toole then said 10 years. So, we've gone from Stephen Harper, we've got to balance the budget at any cost, to Andrew Scheer over 5 years, to Aaron O'Toole over 10. You can just see how the goalposts have changed, right, in the space of a few years around fiscal policy at the federal level. But just to put this in concrete terms, let's say we wanted to balance the budget in 5 years, right? We would need somewhere in the order of probably about 15 to 20 billion. Just a bit of a buffer to deal with some unforeseen consequences or even extra spending room. So how are we going to get 20 billion? what combination of spending cuts or tax increases are we going to do to get that order of magnitude of increase in the budget, right? We within the government, within the operations of government, that's only $120 billion of a base. If you wanted to find $15 to $20 billion and you said it's only going to touch inside government, it's not going to touch people, even though that actually does touch services that people use, it would be very hard to use that relatively small base of 120 billion to try to find your entire hole to plug. So what's the combination, right, of the way in which you're going to raise taxes? We don't like that. That combination is not something that our political discourse is really set up for.
Can I jump in and ask you something? Because I know you're expert about this, which is I didn't read Thomas Piketty because it's too long and complex for me. It doesn't have enough pictures. But I did read about Thomas Piketty, and what I gather he thinks is that the real money is not in income anymore, it's in wealth. And that by trying to get at affluent people through income, we're missing where the real money is, and the real money's in wealth. Is there any thinking about how to get people who have enormous reserves of wealth to pay taxes on that?
So, I mean, I'd be curious what Sean and Jennifer have to say about this. But I mean, the short answer to your question, David, is there is money there. It's just extremely hard to tax because we actually don't really have tax bases at the federal level to try to track that. So we have to create a whole bunch of new stuff. But the other problem is that it's actually just a lot easier to move the wealth around, right? And it will be difficult to actually keep it in place in the time in which you need to be able to tax it. And, it's popular. Taxation of wealth is popular. If you wanted to find a backdoor way into this debate, I mean, capital gains taxation is the obvious backdoor way into the debate. But again, I don't know how ready we are for that political discourse.
Anybody else got a take on that?
Just to agree with what Tyler was saying, that, what was it, last election or the one before, the NDP proposed a wealth tax, based on some academic work that's been done in the States. And the real problem is it's the implementation, right? Exactly as Tyler is saying, like we don't track what people have in terms of their various complex forms of wealth. There's also the issue of things that actually are embedded in our tax system that actually encourage these kinds of forms of tax planning. For example, dividend income splitting and so forth, right? And permitting fairly complex structures within corporations and whatnot. So, look, capital gains, 100%. That would be one backdoor way in. I think that there's maybe also room to be looking at just in general, what are the incentive structures that we allow very legally, right, in terms of permissible activity that are facilitating that issue of making wealth. It's super easy to move around. It's super liquid, right? You want to tax me over here? Fine, I'll move it over there.
Let me take up, though, a kind of broader conceptual point, which kind of underpins this conversation. David, you mentioned that sometime between the 1990s and, say, the global financial crisis, thinking about balanced budgets and deficits seem to have changed, and that's carried on over the past several years. And as Taylor, I think, rightly observes, it's not limited to this government. Even the Conservative Party has made adjustments to the way it thinks and talks about deficit spending. But I would say this notions of equity have also evolved a great deal from the 2000 fall economic statement tabled by Paul Martin, which contained significant tax increases, including to the treatment of capital gains, to the present, when it seems to me equity is a lens that is applied, not sort of to the overall tax and transfer system, but increasingly in our political discourse to every single policy choice a government makes. I think there are various hypotheses to how and when this thinking evolved. I'd point to the Barack Obama's insurgent candidacy in 2008, the rise of the Occupy Wall Street movement. But I think there's something unhealthy to it. No one would disagree that the system ought to be a progressive overall. But I think we risk eroding the incentives for investment, entrepreneurship, frankly, for households to be able to purchase a home and invest in their children's future and so on. If every single choice that the government subjects itself to first goes through the lens of equity, I think it's a trend that probably the car has been steered too far in the opposite direction and probably needs some rebalancing moving forward, particularly in the context in which, according to this budget, real GDP growth is going to be about 1.6% on average over the next 5 years. A growth agenda is probably going to have to lean into economic efficiency a bit and recognize that may come with some trade-offs concerning equity.
In my experience, by the way, growth in the 1% range feels to people like a recession. Okay, so let's move to a couple things that aren't in the budget that caught people's attention. First of all, let's start, Jennifer, because you raised it. Let's start with EI. So you'll tell me the precise numbers, but I'll just generalize. EI doesn't cover anybody anymore. And so...
Well, hold on, though. It does. It does actually cover people. It's just you have to actually have worked in a certain kind of way. But the majority of people who work,
I get it, Tyler. I was being a little flip. But when I collected UI, as it was called, back in the late 1980s, it's because I had a job and I'd been laid off of that job, and my employer and I had paid into employment insurance. Now, most jobs, if I get laid off of my job as a pizza delivery guy for pizza, unlikely I have paid into EI, and unlikely that I am eligible for EI. And that applies to a whole lot of people that are on contract work or gig work or various other things. So the general problem, if I could outline it, is that a lot of people are working and may lose their jobs in an economic downturn that do not have EI coverage right now. And that's something that's happened over the last 20, 25 years, the changing nature of work. It feels to me like an issue that this government would care about. Jennifer, why do you think they haven't moved on it?
Because it's really freaking expensive and politically fraught to do anything at all on EI. So just to clarify a couple of things. So it varies region to region. Remember, we've got 60 odd different EI regions with slightly different, variations in terms of eligibility criteria. Well, sorry, all the same eligibility criteria, but the levels differ, right? But on average, it's about 40% of unemployed workers who will end up qualifying for employment insurance. Yep. Biggest chunk don't qualify because they were not in insured income, or they didn't have insured income. They were not in that kind of employment arrangement. So there's work to be done in terms of clarifying and cracking down on that. The budget actually did have something kind of positive in that regards, right, in terms of trying to bring more gig workers in to EI and CPP coverage, leveling some of the bad incentives, right, for some businesses to hire people as dependent contractors instead of recognizing they actually probably are deemed employees. But it's not just about that. It's also about there are some fundamental rules within EI in terms of depending on the region that you're in. You may fall short of your insured hours by just a tiny little bit. So there's questions. I hate to use the word equity, but there are some regional equity issues here, right? And frankly, women in particular seem to be particularly negatively impacted by a lot of those sort of technocratic rules. So there's a gender equity lens to this too. Let's also remember EI has a ton of jobs now. It's the fiscal stabilizer, but it's not just that. It's not just unemployment insurance, right? It also has all of these sort of social functions. And that actually maybe the discussion around coverage and who pays for what should be disaggregating and thinking more clearly about who pays for what and who do we have a social kind of, a social purpose, right, in ensuring people have coverage. Do we necessarily need to make sure that every single, doctor, lawyer, dentist, self-employed professional has access to EI? I'm not sure. I'm not convinced. Right? Do we want to do a better job of making sure that low-wage, vulnerable workers who might be combining different forms of employment have access to some temporary income assistance if they are suffering through a downturn? Probably. And then there's the whole other area of the special benefits. Anyway, long-winded answer to there's a lot to be done there. And it's politically fraught because, let's be honest, there's regional politics involved here. This is also potentially fiscally really challenging, right? Even small, tiny changes, like basically EI has been running for the last, 10, 12 years, kind of on a knife edge, right? Like not generating big surpluses, but also until the pandemic, not falling into massive deficit. So you want to change any of those parameters, you got to figure out how to pay for it internally. And nobody likes to talk about EI premiums. And so far, the government does not want to say anything publicly about its willingness or openness to doing tripartite funding where it comes in and actually generates, provides some of the funding for EI out of general revenues.
Mm-hmm. So is this program on the verge of being on its way out? I mean, if it's only covering 40% of people and the economy is continuing to change, I mean, are we going to end up without an effective, well, we already are without an effective EI program, but are we going to end up without one, period? Tyler, where does this go?
Well, look, and I apologize for interrupting you there, David, before. It's just that this issue is fraught with a lot of very, very, very complex considerations. And I think what's interesting about EI reform is the government has committed many times to doing EI reform. And in fact, we saw during the pandemic what the frailties of the system were, of why you needed to have more universal coverage for things, right? It's actually why CERB eventually replaced the EI system. And if by the next recession, we don't have a way to fix not all of those problems, because it's not exactly about responding to the unique event of the pandemic, but at least the weaknesses that we saw in our system in the last major recession, before we get to the next major recession, I think it will not reflect well on the government necessarily. And it is a little odd, I will admit, because if you go back to the fall economic statement, the government started to acknowledge that was kind of the pivot point where they said, it's possible we're now actually going to have a recession in 2023. And so now that we've accepted the recession, are we recession proofing ourselves, right? And how are we preparing for, because recessions happen, right? There's always going to be a recession at the next point in the economic cycle. So we've got to get ahead of this. I am hopeful that something will get done, but this is a big battleship to move. And clearly the key weakness that we saw in the pandemic was people who don't work in a traditional job, as you said, David, who have part-time work, who have certain hours that they piece together, who may be self-employed, they are the people that are in the first order, probably the most outside of the system and need to be brought in.
Hey, Sean, can I ask you to put your economist hat on for a second? Be an economist, which is, I'm not. But I was schooled early on that things like EI in our economy were not just ways of supporting people through a difficult time in their life, but they were what was at least once referred to in economic terms as automatic stabilizers for the economy. Yes. That there were certain things like EI that kicked in when a recession happened that helped the economy stabilize because people still had spending power and it didn't fall further into recession. Is that an obsolete notion?
Yeah, the short answer is no. That EI remains, amongst other programs, the first line of defense in the event of a recession, which only reinforces the need, as Jennifer and Tyler observe, to advance a more ambitious program of reform. I'm a bit self-conscious talking about this issue because they're both such experts, including Tyler, who, as he said, was intimately involved in the creation of the CERB precisely because EI was inadequate given the scope and magnitude of the job losses in the context of the pandemic. Even in an event that a recession doesn't produce job losses of that scope, it still means that there are going to be people falling through the cracks. And so every day we delay reform puts those people at risk. Can I just raise a separate but related point, though, David? It sort of reverts to our earlier conversation about energy transition. This is something I worry about a great deal from a political economy point of view, from the view of national unity and social cohesion. We have a series of policies at the federal and provincial level which are designed to push natural resource companies to change the way they do business in the name of pursuing the goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, I'm on board for that agenda. But the people affected are going to be heavily concentrated in a small number of places, particularly the province of Alberta. And I think offering them, many of whom have made good wages, oftentimes, as Tyler said, union wages over the past several years working in those industries, and to have their jobs effectively destroyed by government policy, I think we're going to have to offer them more than just the base employment insurance model, which would have them suffer, overnight pretty significant reductions in their wages and incomes. I think the government has been talking about at different times what it called. The name escapes me now. What was it called?
Just transition, but they don't like it
transition,
themselves.
And now
they can't stop using it, but they don't like it themselves.
Yes, now it's being called sustainable jobs. But I think that I would just throw it in the mix as we're talking about employment insurance. We're going to have something like EI plus for the workers affected by the energy transition. Or I worry, David, that the political reverberations across the country could be really, really significant.
Yeah, I just think Joe Biden keeps kicking this government environmental policy right in the bloody shins. I mean, to my mind, it's getting very, very difficult to differentiate what the Conservatives in Canada say about climate policy and what Biden says about climate policy, and it's that I think is problematic for the friendly Trudeau government with Biden.
Let me say a word there. I think the only difference is the commitment to deficit spend, right? And I think that will. Let me just take up that point because I think it's a really interesting one. Pierre Poilievre is committed to repealing the carbon tax. That's self-evident, but he's going to have a climate plan. It's become a threshold issue for a lot of Canadian voters. And it seems to me a plan that would probably pass muster looks a lot like some of the things the Trudeau government did in yesterday's budget. But of course, the Conservatives are at least rhetorically averse because of the increase in spending and deficit financing. So that'll be something I think the Conservatives need to square. But I think your instinct is right. That where they ultimately need to get is something sounding and looking a lot like what the Biden administration is doing on this file.
So, hey, we're over time. I'm presuming that you've got a few more minutes to stay, do you? Or does somebody have a hard stop?
I'm close to a hard stop.
How close?
Probably about 2 to 3 minutes.
All right, then we're going to have to wrap up. I want a quick word, though, before we do, on housing. This seems to be one of the biggest gaps, at least politically, in the budget from my standpoint. And housing is an issue that if somebody came down from the mountain with the tablets and said, this is going to make housing affordable for people in this country, that you could win an election on it. It's that politically potent right now. Nothing in the budget about it. Is that because there's nothing the federal government can think of to do? Tyler, I'll start with you.
No, it's not because there's nothing that they think they can do. They've been doing a lot in this space really since the first or second year of the government. It just it isn't at the huge scale that is probably needed, and certainly hasn't kept up with, I think, the mood of the country. And arguably, like, there is actually a multi-party consensus about kind of the components of what you need to do in terms of more money, more land, some incentives, some carrots, some sticks, some tax changes, etc. But it just there isn't between the provinces and the federal government and the cities a sense of leadership and ambition and scale. And I think this is a huge political liability for the government that will play out over the next year. I think their sense is that they've got a year to come back at this. But as I said off the top, I think this was a choice. I think it was a conscious decision that the budget couldn't do everything, and they thought, we've done a lot in this space, we can wait until next year.
Jennifer, I've had housing people come on and say, you know what, the federal government has two levers. It has money and it has a convening power. And why doesn't it use those two things to drive change at the provincial and municipal level where it has to happen?
Why doesn't it do that? Because, frankly, partly Constitution, right? Like, let's be honest. Also, partly what is the money lever that we would imagine that the government would be using? Remember, you can kind of only on that sort of stuff get to the municipalities through the provinces. They've been trying to put some of those levers and some of those pressure points in infrastructure funding on public transit. Not clear that it's actually going to yield the kind of behavioral changes and so forth that is hoped for. Because again, maybe it's just not at the right scale, or maybe it's not actually hooked up to the right kind of money incentive. But it's also true that the federal government does have its own direct money through the tax system to some degree, also through CMHC that hits directly on the consumer side. And maybe that is also an area that bears further consideration and discussion. I noticed, Tyler's going to hate me for saying this, but I noticed yesterday in the budget they re-announced yet another home ownership savings account that has sort of, a model design in my view. I don't know that we need another home ownership savings account, right? Like we got a lot of those already. Maybe that money could have been better directed elsewhere.
The one lever Ottawa does have control over, though, is immigration. And it seems to me that the Trudeau government has made a major bet on immigration policy, raising the annual PR intake to 500,000 per year. That doesn't even account for visas and temporary foreign workers and others, which takes the annual rate of immigration into the country something north of 1.2 million. I happen to think these are good things, David. But if we don't do something on housing, it seems to me we're playing with fire. Canada has achieved something very few other countries have, which is relatively high levels of public support for relatively high levels of immigration. And if we don't make progress on housing, it seems to me that is put under serious stress. And so, I can't help but think that it may mean the Trudeau government needs to dial back some of its ambition on immigration policy until Canadians, through a process of trust but verify, see a more credible plan on housing starts, particularly in the major centers where immigrants tend to disproportionately settle.
And David, if I could just put a qualitative point on what Sean just said there. So Sean and I actually both teach at U of T in the Munk School. We teach in the same course, actually, which is interesting. And one of the things that's been really interesting to me this year is that we have a lot of students who are actually talking about housing in their papers because they're worried about it. And they're actually starting to make this linkage between immigration and the risks and the challenges that that's posing to the system, and whether we are ready and the market is able to actually meet that demand. And I just think qualitatively, that's really interesting that young people are starting to draw that link, because as Sean says, if that political acceptability for immigration breaks down, that will be really problematic for us because it is actually an engine of future growth.
Just last question for you, Tyler. Why doesn't the federal government go back, at a minimum, go back to doing what it used to do? So my understanding is government used to be very involved in building housing across the country, and Mulroney and Wilson started to kill that, and Chrystia and Martin killed it off entirely. And I hear that linked to our current problem all the time. So why doesn't the government just get back into that business?
So they are actually doing a version of that. The difference is that rather than, in some cases, directly subsidizing those projects themselves, those are now transfers to provinces through these new housing agreements that exist between the federal government and the provinces. And, to be honest, politically speaking, Justin Trudeau probably carries more of the political accountability for that than does Doug Ford. And I think the government needs to reassess in the national housing strategy, is that working? And is the scale of what they're doing necessary? And we need a leader that kind of says, all tools are on the table, because if we don't get this right, we're actually not just, we have a generational problem that's going to create, and the risks that that's going to create in society. But it's also going to mean that all this talent that we're bringing here, which is the future of our economic growth, may not stay if we can't actually provide an affordable housing market.
Canadians who don't own a house and don't think they'll ever own a house don't think they're middle class. All right. I want to thank you so much for this. I've kept you over time, and you've been very generous with your time and with your thoughts. I love getting the three of you together to talk on this show. I can't wait to have you back. But at the moment, I will let you go. So thank the three of you for doing this. I want to thank everybody who watched or listened. And of course, I want to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our sponsors, CN and Uber Canada. You've learned a lot about the budget today. Come back next week and learn about something else. We'll see you then. Take care.